Today, on virtually every college and university campus, there are veterans. These particular students are generally a little older than the typical college student, and you can usually tell them apart. Maybe they walk a little straighter, dress a little neater, or talk more in class. Whatever it is, you can usually tell. Most have returned to school after completing their military service under the auspices of the GI Bill. Most people have heard of it, especially on campuses, and most people know that it pays for veterans to go to school. Yet how many people know why there is a GI Bill or where it came from? Do the veterans themselves even know? To find some answers, let's take a look at some relatively recent history of veterans' benefits in the United States to gain some perspective. After World War I, American doughboys returned from the fighting in Europe. They were given medals, parades, and $60 mustering out pay from a grateful nation. None of that helped them much as the United States shifted away from a wartime economy. The men who had stayed behind and worked were more valuable to employers as they had already been trained. The veterans were faced with a high unemployment rate and few prospects. In 1924, after years of struggle on the part of the soldiers and their representative organizations, the Disabled American Veterans, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and the newest one, created by and for World War I veterans, the American Legion, a bonus bill was passed by Congress and became law, despite a veto by then-President Coolidge. The World War Adjusted Compensation Act of 1924 recognized the disparity of pay for veterans and awarded additional compensation to that which had already been paid. However, there was a significant catch. The money from the bill would not be paid until 1945 or upon the death of the recipient. It was derisively named by the veterans the Tombstone Bill. At the time, the recognition was enough for many of the veterans. The economy had improved, and the need for the cash was not as great as it had been. By the end of the decade, things had changed substantially. The nation was hit hard by the stock market crash of 1929. By 1932, unemployment had reached a record 25%, and for veterans it was much the same. For many of them, the only asset they had left by then was the certificate for compensation issued to them by the United States government, the Tombstone Bonus. Jobless, homeless, and with little to lose, more than 40,000 of them, including over 300 families, marched on Washington from all over the country to ask for early payment of their bonus. Led by a veteran named Walter Waters, they stayed in abandoned buildings and warehouses. Some were put up by sympathetic locals. The great majority, though, lived in tents in a large field in Anacostia, Virginia, just over the river from Washington, D.C. For months the men lived in tents and shanties made from cardboard and wood, or anything that could be found and converted into shelters. They slept on the ground, or in anything they could scrounge up. It was all for nothing, though, as Congress would not pass an early payment bill, and fearful of so many angry, military-trained former soldiers, President Herbert Hoover ordered the United States Army to forcibly remove them from their camps in Washington, D.C. General Douglas MacArthur carried out those orders using regular troops with tanks and tear gas and fixed bayonets. Fully covered by the media, this eviction probably cost Hoover the 1932 election. In 1936, overriding a veto by President Franklin Roosevelt, Congress passed the Adjusted Compensation Payment Act, and the veterans got their money. Fast forward 5 years. December 7th, 1941, and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The next day war was declared, and this one will be bigger and meaner than the last. It is important to mention that, at this time, many members of the United States Congress were veterans of World War I. This was going to have a big impact on how the new veterans were going to be treated. By 1943, President Roosevelt was already beginning to consider veterans legislation for after the war's end. He remembered the turmoil of the interwar years that the issue had created, both socially and politically. Roosevelt put together 2 different committees to consider how to treat veterans after the war was over. He broadcast their findings on one of his famous radio fireside chats.
Among many other things, we are today laying plans for the return to civilian life of our gallant men and women in the armed services. They must not be demobilized into an environment of inflation and unemployment, to a place on the breadline or on a corner selling apples. We must this time have plans ready, instead of waiting to do a hasty, inefficient, and ill-considered job at the last moment. I have assured our men in the armed forces that the American people would not let them down when the war is won. The least to which they're entitled, it seems to me, is something like this. First, mustering out pay to every member of the armed forces and merchant marine when he or she is honorably discharged. Mustering out pay large enough in each case to cover a reasonable period of time between his discharge and the finding of a new job. Secondly, in case no job is found after diligent search, then unemployment insurance if the individual registers with the United States Employment Service. Third, an opportunity for members of the armed services to get further education or trade training at the cost of their government. Fourth, allowance of credit to all members of the armed forces under unemployment compensation and federal old age and survivors insurance for their period of service. For these purposes, they ought to be treated as if they had continued their employment in private industry. Fifth, improved and liberalized provisions for hospitalization, for rehabilitation, for medical care of disabled members of the armed forces and the merchant marine. And finally, sufficient pensions for disabled members of the armed forces.
As early as 1943, American men and women were fighting all over the world, in the air, on land, and sea, and many were coming home wounded. At this time, there was little to no support system in place for those wounded veterans after they were discharged. This may not have placed them in immediate danger to their health, but most were permanently disabled with no income and no one but friends and relatives to look after them. In stepped the American Legion. The Legion had had its charter amended to let the new veterans join their organization, and they went to work representing them. Legion National Commander Warren Atherton put together a committee under former Illinois Governor and Legion member John Stell to come up with ideas for legislation to be submitted to Congress for the care of veterans of this new war. There was both an immediate need for the neglected wounded and a long-term one, as they did not want to see the same kind of ill-considered, uncoordinated measures that were common after the last war. Also, there was another level to the Legion planning. They were a conservative organization which had always been unhappy with the thought of military pensions. For years they had been considering how good veterans legislation should be put together. Also, there were many different bills being considered in Congress already, yet all of them were separate from each other and therefore extremely inefficient, almost guaranteeing their failure even if passed. American Legion Veterans Legislation Committee member and past President Harry Colmary thought on these issues while he was staying at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. He wrote notes on sheets of scrap paper, putting together all of the different ideas into one large one that considered every veterans issue he could think of. He also drew on things that President Roosevelt had mentioned in the fireside radio chat he had broadcast a few months earlier. Atherton, Stell, Colmary, and the others of the Legion Committee felt that the need to aid the disabled veterans was an urgent matter. The vets needed help, and they needed it right then. Through a national public relations campaign, they managed to get their legislation passed and signed by the President in just 6 months. That is lightning speed for the United States Congress. The GI Bill was signed into law by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in June of 1944. This bill was different from all the other bills concerning the treatment of veterans that had ever become law before. Not only did it include provisions never before contemplated, it was comprehensive. It provided unemployment benefits for discharged veterans, as well as government-guaranteed home and business loans, provided hospitalization for wounded veterans, and the most famous benefit, education. Out of the wreckage that had been veterans' benefits during the interwar years arose the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. This legislation became the benchmark for how the United States would treat their military veterans right up until the present day.